Hello, YouTube. My name is Alan, and it's that time once again. Let's talk metal. Tonight, we're going to be talking a bit about power metal, some things that I am not enjoying about the current power metal scene, and some things that I am enjoying. Before I get to that, however, want to give a quick thank you for some VC LT material that I recently got from Jurgen over at Jurgen Six Beers, Nine Wives. Everybody knows who Jurgen is. He's, seen every band imaginable, met everyone imaginable, never had to go farther than 20 miles from his house. Oh, excuse me, 20 kilometers from his house because Germany, because metric system. But yes, Jurgen was kind enough to send me a couple of things, and I definitely wanted to say thank you for them. A couple of Van Records releases, a label that I enjoy a lot. One of them was the second Chapel of Disease album. Had never seen this on vinyl before. It's on a cool kind of amber colored vinyl. And he also sent me a copy of the Atlantean Codex live album, The Annihilation of Bavaria. It's a 2 LP set with a DVD included as well. So big thank you to Jurgen for sending those. Very kind of him to do so. Uh, Van Records material, not the easiest to find in the United States, and certainly kind of expensive when you do find it in the US. So thanks so much, Jurgen. I really appreciate both of those. They're both fantastic albums that I enjoy a lot. All right, on to tonight's topic. Um, I'll talk about something that's bugged me with power metal, and this has come up a few times on some heavy metallurgy streams, but I wanted to kind of articulate it, flesh it out a little bit as its own episode. Uh, Over the past few months, I've picked up a couple of power metal albums by relatively popular current bands, and I just cannot get into them. The two I'm talking about in particular here tonight are first the band Windrose. I got the Warfront album back in the fall. And second, the band Gloryhammer. And I got this album, which is Legends from Beyond the Galactic Terror Vortex, and picked this one up a month or two ago. Um, Again, relatively popular bands these days. And I just can't get into either of them. And there are other bands of this ilk that have also been hard for me to get into. You know, traditionally, I'm very much into power metal. I like it quite a bit. It's one of the genres I've listened to for decades. There's some things about this current crop of bands that just doesn't quite sit well with me. And rather than just say they suck, I've been kind of listening to them a few more times and trying to think through it. What exactly is it that bugs me about these bands? So, first, I'm going to try to explain what I think these bands are missing, why it is that I'm not connecting with them. Second, I'm going to talk a little bit, kind of a brief history of power metal to kind of see how did we get to the point where bands like this were becoming popular, because I think there's a little bit of a trend over time when I sat down and thought about it. And then third, I want to highlight some current power metal bands that I think are really, really good and should get some more attention. Again, I want to make it clear that I'm not trying to crap on the entire subgenre. I think there's a lot of bands that are doing great work. For me personally, I just don't think these two bands are among them. And I know other people like them. Marty over at Heavy Metallurgy likes them, and that's absolutely fine. I'm really not here to yuck anyone's yum. I feel a little bad about, yeah, kind of ragging on these bands. If you enjoy these bands and their style of power metal, that's great, fantastic. In fact, I can see these bands serving kind of a good purpose as a gateway into heavy metal for some people. Not everyone's going to jump into heavy metal with black metal or death metal or stuff like that. Some people are going to start with something that's a little easier on the ears, especially in the vocal department. And bands like these, I could see them, as excellent gateway bands. And some of those fans will never, really stray any farther down the heavy metal rabbit hole. That's okay. But some of them will start checking out more and more bands and different subgenres and styles, and really get into a lot of metal. And this is their starting point. That's fantastic. I'm glad that worked out the way it did. But for me, I guess, as the, grumpy old power metal veteran of 30 some years listening under my belt, yeah, these bands just, they won't connect with me, at least not yet. But why is that? Well, the first thing that does bug me about these two acts and similar ones as well, I'm just using these as examples of this style since they're the ones I've bought recently. I do have a problem with the visual presentation that the bands are going for. Uh, these bands are very much doing a lot of cosplay, and I'm not trying to say that in a real derogatory way, but when you look at pictures, images of the band, they're constantly dressed up in, stuff that looks like, you'd wear going to a Ren fair. They've got the capes, they've got the fake weapons, they've got the cloaks and, boots and fake elf ears and, all this, kind of gear. Windrose goes for this kind of dwarven look, with the big shoulder pauldrons and, the long beards and all this kind of stuff. And to most people, it looks very, very cheesy. And it's like, well, that's true, but lots of things in heavy metal look kind of cheesy. These aren't the first bands to ever kind of use costumes and stuff like that to some effect. Um, Hello, black metal, corpse paint, it's a thing. Other bands, even in power metal, have done it. One of my favorite power metal bands of all time, Running Wild. They've got the whole pirate costume thing going on and have since the mid 1980s. So I can't say it's just the fact that they're dressed up that's bugging me. So what is the problem? Uh, it's a couple of things. With these bands making the costumes, such a big part of their presentation, and it kind of carries over into their videos, being very outlandish, kind of cartoonish. Um, it makes it very easy for people to be derogatory and dismissive towards power metal. And this is a windmill I've been tilting at for decades. A lot of metal fans have always been kind of belittling towards power metal. It was not heavy enough, not extreme enough. It sounds too happy. The bands play a ballad sometimes. This band is too silly. It's not serious enough. And it's always bugged me because sure, power metal has those elements and has for a long time, but a lot of the power metal bands also were kick-ass musicians that wrote great songs, could play very fast, very technical. They were just a bit, catchier and didn't utilize more extreme elements. But, they were a very legit part of heavy metal. And I've been making that case for ages. But then when bands like these two, come along and they start really leaning into that, kind of, yes, we're going to be in our LARPing gear all the time and make it as silly and as ridiculous as we can. It's like, guys, I'm trying to stand up for this power metal subgenre here. You're not making it easy for me to do so because a lot of people are going to take one look at you and be like, yep, and see, right there's what I mean. These guys look like they're straight from the Ren Fair or something, and it's just, lame to them. And so they're never going to give those bands or other power metal bands much of a chance. Should they dismiss them based on visual aspects? No. But people do that. It's in reality, it's going to happen whether you should or not. Uh, So yeah, that's one issue. These bands really make this very, fantasy-driven, Dungeons and Dragons themed visual presentation such a big part of what they do that you just can't avoid it. Running Wild, on the other hand, it's not like every band member was ever out there dressed up as a full-blown pirate on stage night after night after night. Another difference here is that musically, a band like Running Wild, sure, they might dress like pirates. They played like heavy metal badasses. You have ripping guitar solos, tons of double bass driving everything forward, good choruses, wide range of lyrical topics. They didn't just sing about pirates every song. Sure, they have some piracy songs. A lot of them are steeped in actual historical pirates and battles and events. They had tons of songs about Native American culture, biker culture, just general songs and odes to freedom and heavy metal and other historical topics. They covered a wide gambit of typical heavy metal fodder. A lot of these, more, cosplay themed bands, they really just stick to their kind of, one gimmick. And a perfect example of this that I don't have a CD of is Alestorm. Alestorm's that other pirate metal band. And what are their songs about? Metal and beer, metal and beer, pirate, women, wenches, pirates, beer, bounce a rubber duck around and do it all over again. It's just kind of a very narrow thing that they do, and they keep doing it over and over. And musically, I feel like these two bands are doing the same thing. Windrose's music, it leans on the choruses a lot. It's very drums and synth driven. Lots of synthesizer layers and drums to keep, this kind of bouncing, catchy beat going as you repeat the chorus and re-repeat the chorus. Stringed instruments don't have a very prominent role here, which is unusual for me in power metal. I'm used to having a much stronger guitar presence, and every time in one of these songs is playing, I feel like, okay, this is where the guitar solo should kick in. The keys and the percussion just keep carrying the song along, and the guitars rarely step forward. It's makes it feel kind of watered down in a way. Now, Gloryhammer, on the other hand, there's more, guitar presence here, but it's not outstanding. For me, Gloryhammer is playing, power metal that is kind of paint by numbers. It is the very basics of European flavored power metal. And for some folks, again, if this is their introduction, one of the first times they've checked the style out, they might like it. That's great. For someone like myself who's been listening to it for ages, I've heard so many other bands do it and do it better than this. Not only all the, big name heavyweights from like Halloween, Gamma Ray and Blind Guardian, Stratovarius, but there's an entire glut of bands that came out in the early 2000s on labels like LMP. You had, Black Majesty, Cryonic Temple, Galaglass. And all these were, very solid bands, and they did power metal of this style better than Gloryhammer as well. So I guess what it's coming down to is I feel like many of these, cosplay bands, they musically are not delivering the goods. So, Running Wild could, dress up like pirates and people could laugh about it and make jokes about it. But when they started playing, the music was kick ass. When, Windrose and Gloryhammer start playing, I don't get that same sensation from either of them. Again, it seems like for bands like this, it seems that the gimmick comes first and the music comes second. And that's maybe the most succinct way I can put it. With Gloryhammer, it's all about the, just ridiculous song titles. There's one on here that's something like, um, Power of the Laser Dragonfire. It almost just feels like something AI would generate as a song title. Let's take a bunch of, random power metal words, enchanted dragon, sword dwarf. Just string it together, make it sound kind of kooky and outrageous. There you go, run with it. And I just can't quite get into that. I wish the bands maybe would take themselves just a little more seriously, but at the same time, the gimmick has worked for them. They're relatively popular, so congratulations on making a very simple thing work out to your advantage. I just, for me as a longtime power metal fan, it's not a style I'm enjoying much. So how did we get to the point where power metal bands were so heavily invested more in like, costumes and, very, outlandish song titles rather than just focusing on the music? Well, backing up here, and before I start down this kind of second part, when I'm talking about power metal, I'm very much sticking to more the European style of power metal. Yes, the term can be applied to lots of US bands from the 80s as well. Trying to figure out exactly where the line between those styles is, that can be very difficult to do. I'm not here in this video to try to nail down that division. It's pretty blurry. There's a lot of bleed over between what counts as traditional or classic metal and where power metal begins. But I think most people could agree, or at least many people could agree, European power metal really started to take shape with Halloween, Keeper of the Seven Keys Part 1, and on into Keeper of the Seven Keys Part 2. That, this defined a lot of those elements. You had a really strong vocalist. You have excellent guitarists. You have a lot of double bass work, driving the songs forward at a pretty fast pace most of the time. You've got catchy choruses. you often do have a little more of an upbeat, positive demeanor rather than, sad, depressive, suicidal, the tropes we usually associate with heavy metal. You've got, yeah, songs that are meant to stick with you and could do so very effectively. And we saw a lot of bands, there in the late 80s and early 90s, follow up with this style. You had, your Running Wilds, Blind Guardian, Scanner. Kind of the textbook definition of what I'm talking about is gamma ray. Kai Hansen's post-Halloween band. After their first couple of albums, gamma ray kind of became the standard for power metal. And yes, bands like Halloween, gamma ray, they can be a little goofy at times. They'll have that one silly song per album. They might have that one power ballad per album. Some people really just dismiss it, the whole style, just on that. I don't mind if they have one power ballad on the album. Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, but it's one song. Most albums are going to have one or two songs I don't like anyway, regardless of the style. They also have a ton of super fast headbanging killers on most of their albums. So, yeah, one power ballad, so what? Skip it. So, yeah, you had a good wave of these bands, in the earliest 90s, but they didn't get a lot of attention, at least in the United States. They did okay in Europe, they did okay in Japan. The US, this style of power metal just wasn't a thing. It's funny because Halloween did pretty good in the US with the Keeper stuff, but Halloween ran into legal issues that kind of put them on ice for a while, and the whole US music landscape changed. A lot of heavy metal didn't do well. In the 90s, new styles came in, power metal was off everybody's radar until about 1997 or so. At that point, one band in particular, Hammerfall, really kind of picked up that flag and started carrying it forward again, and made a big splash and got people to start noticing classical and power metal all over again. And again, Hammerfall, considered a power metal band in my book, but they did a lot of stuff that would lean into traditional metal. That's fine. That's not the point of this topic. So Hammerfall started to really revive the genre, especially in the United States. They weren't alone in doing this. Rhapsody also came along in the mid and late 90s and also kind of helped push that forward. And these boards helped raise the visibility for some of the early 90s metal bands that hadn't ever really gotten a crack in the US before. Thinking of bands like Blind Guardian. Nightfall and Middle Earth came out in the late 90s and, yeah, was a big thing. Stradivarius started getting much more popular around this time. And then you had again, a wave of other bands, of course, started following in everyone's footsteps. Some of the bands that started popping up along this time, though, were doing things a little different within power metal. One example of this is Sonata Arctica. Sonata Arctica is a solid power metal band. They have a lot of the traits I reeled off a few minutes ago. Good vocalist, good guitar work, catchy songs, etc., etc. Sonata Arctica, though, also had what Marty described on Heavy Metallurgy as kind of a fragile sound. They, don't really kick ass in the same way that, Gamma Ray or Blind Guardian or some of these other bands do. They always sound just a little bit more lightweight. In my opinion, Stradivarius always had this quality just a little bit as well. Not as much as Sonata Arctica, but yeah, this is tough. It's not that it feels more tame, but it doesn't seem to, it's not really making you want to crank it up loud and bang your head and air guitar furiously. It seems like it's, maybe aiming towards a little bit different reaction and perhaps a little bit of a different listening demographic. The same can be true of another band that started to become popular there at the turn of the century, and that is Nightwish. Here was power metal sort of going into this, female-fronted symphonic direction. Other bands had been doing symphonic flavors of power metal before this. Again, Blind Guardian was already experimenting with this by the late 90s. But with Nightwish, it was a bit different because the idea was you had this really amazing female vocalist, and the band would just kind of lay back more and kind of support her. It was very the attention was meant to be focused on her, and as such, you didn't have, tons of guitar solos blazing away all over the place. You didn't have, the double bass driving things along. You kind of went for, again, a little bit more of a fragile sound, more kind of airy synth-driven stuff. Percussion keeping the beat moving. Guitars, bass, the stringed instruments are part of this landscape, but they're not up front. The spotlight's not shifting over to them for every solo break. And so again, I started to see a little bit of connection here and things that would come later, like Windrose. Nightwish was insanely popular. Tons of bands started following this formula, and this subgenre of power metal, became a real thing and still is a big thing. And I'm not saying it's a bad subgenre. I know it's not popular with a lot of metalheads, but a lot of these bands were good. I think early Nightwish was fantastic. I've got CDs by Within Temptation, Eden Bridge. There were lots of bands that followed the same thing, and several of them were quite good. But you were, yeah, definitely kind of changing the dynamics of what was power metal there. One more example of how power metal started to shift there in the turn of the century was Tobias Sambat's Avantasia project. This was originally kind of a side project from his Edguy, which was his main band. And the metal opera, he had this idea to, kind of do this big, fantasy story, but bring in different well-known vocalists to do all the different character voices. This is in contrast to other concept albums done before this, where the vocalist just handled all the different parts. Good example of that would be like the House of Atreus albums that Virgin Steel had done a couple of years before this. It was a neat idea. It went over extremely well. There ended up being a metal opera part two. And, 20 some years later, Tobias is Avantasia is his only band now. That guy was eventually folded, and this is his full-time concern now. What's interesting about Avantasia, and why I'm including them in the sequence here, is that the metal opera was originally, again, this kind of concept, high fantasy story throughout the whole thing. And yeah, all the vocalists come in, and Kai Hansen plays a dwarf, I think, and somebody plays a wizard and all that. And it was a neat concept. The issue I had with these is that the story itself is not good. It is very lame, generic fantasy. There's too much of that in the world to begin with. Power metal bands had always, kind of, done a lot of, stuff with fantasy themes and all, but some did it better than others. Again, something like Blind Guardian's Nightfall Middle Earth. Hansi and company farmed, deep into the world of J.R.R. Tolkien to put together an album that was very compelling and represented the source material very nicely. The story on the metal opera, it's just extremely generic. The booklet is very long, and if you try to read through it and understand the whole story, you get to the end of it, and it's just like, what was the point of all this? There's a dwarf and a wizard, and just it feels like somebody wrote a random Dungeons and Dragons campaign and decided, hey, that'd be cool to make into an album. And as such, the music here is great. Having all the different vocalists come in, very cool. But starting to lean into not just fantasy, but very kind of generic, watered down fantasy is something that power metal started doing more and more and more. And much like the pulp material itself, you just don't need but so much of that. And that's where I think you start to have issues today with, bands like, Gloryhammer. Gloryhammer's albums are all supposed to be this one long, great continuing saga that they've just kind of made up and thrown together with, characters with silly names, doing silly things. It's just, again, it feels like a bunch of concepts that an AI bot would put together if you said, create me a sci-fi / high fantasy story, epic story. Here you go. This character, Angus the 17th, will fly into the sun to blow up the earth, riding a laser shooting dinosaur to destroy the Dark Lord, blah, 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 hoots, before he can escape into the Terror Vortex. It just becomes word vomit. It doesn't mean anything. Right? I'm not saying that every band has to go to Michael Moorcock or H.P. Lovecraft or Tolkien for source material, but it would be nice if they maybe put a little more effort into coming up with stories, places, flesh them out a little bit, make them more compelling, instead of just, kind of catering to the lowest common denominator amongst that kind of fantasy. And to be, fair, bands like Rhapsody weren't above doing this too. Rhapsody's got a whole lot of enchanted emerald dragon swords flying around in their music sometimes. But it's something that has kind of become more and more progressively an issue with many power metal bands going in that direction. And that's yet another reason that when I get to some of these newer bands, I'm not interested in this dippy story about Angus and Hoots, and I don't even know what the villain's name is, and I don't care. It's so one-dimensional that it doesn't interest me. Uh, so there you have it. I think, when you look at, the success of Nightwish, kind of scaling back the music a little bit, and you look at the success of bands like Avantasia and Rhapsody, building up, a ton of popularity while relying on, pretty generic fantasy stuff in their lyrics, it kind of helps explain where we've gotten to with bands like, Windrose, Gloryhammer, and Alestorm. What was the next step forward for them? What was going to distinguish them from those bands? Well, build on what they did, but kind of just turn the visual over the top in your face aspect of it, turn it up to 11 and be in costume all the time and make the stories even more outlandish, I guess. So there we are. Quick look at power metal, how I think we got to the point where some of these newer bands are in this kind of weird cosplay and sci-fi Dungeons and Dragons type environment that they've landed in. All right, for the third and last part, did want to highlight some current ongoing power metal bands that I think are really great and doing things well. So again, I don't want to just sit here and be, poo-pooing the whole power metal thing anyway. I've complained about it. Well, let me offer a solution. Okay, here's some bands I think do it much better that should get more attention, or if someone is new to the genre and just hasn't had a chance to check them out, here you go. Here's some recommendations. Uh, and again, some of these are pretty classic power metal style. Some of them you might contend, I think that's more of an epic metal band or more of a trad metal band. Okay, again, those lines can be very blurry between some of these subgenres. I'm not here to nitpick what is or isn't power metal this time around. But some bands active today that are putting out really good stuff, in my opinion. First up, Blind Guardian is still at it, and their most recent album was kind of a return to form. It's a heavier, faster album. They stripped away more of the symphonic elements this time. It kind of felt like they had something to prove, that they didn't have to rely on all these multiple trackings of different orchestral things, and they did pretty well with it. This is not my favorite Blind Guardian album. I'm not as high on it as some people are. I think it's still a step below what they did in their prime, but at the same time, it's better than what 75, 80% of other power metal bands can put out today. So yeah, Blind Guardian is still very much a going concern and putting out some good stuff. Same can be said about Running Wild. Running Wild did hit a lull there in the early 2000s. They disbanded for a period of time. The past two Running Wild albums, though, have been surprisingly back on point. Are they as good as the band's classic material? No. Are they kind of derivative of the band's early material? Yes. But the albums work very well. It kind of feels like Rolf and company have a little bit of fire back in their belly. And so yeah, these are good albums as well. You can do much, much worse than checking out the last two Running Wild albums. Another German band that's criminally underrated in power metal circles is Storm Warrior. They've been at it for a long time now. They kind of started out very much almost as a clone of early Halloween circa Walls of Jericho. But since then, they've kind of developed their own identity. The music is very Odin themed, and it's kind of generic Odin themed. You'll hear the words Odin, sword, and Valhalla almost more times than you can count. But again, musically they deliver. This is amazingly good European power metal. Great guitar work, great drums, huge choruses. It's all the elements that you want. Are they reinventing the wheel with any of this? No. But are they doing it extremely well? Yes. Storm Warrior stuff can be a little hard and a little pricey to get in the United States. So they haven't played the US very much. But they are a fantastic power metal band that, again, they've got the Odin theme to their music and stuff. There's kind of a gimmick there, but the music comes first. The gimmick is coming second, unlike the other bands that I'm having trouble digesting. Switching to a couple of American bands, Seven Kingdoms out of Florida. Their first album had a different vocalist, but on the second album, they switched to a new singer. She's got a fantastic voice for this style. A lot of their material is very much in the Blind Guardian camp. Early Blind Guardian. Good, fast, power, speed metal Blind Guardian. They're really good at that. The most recent album has a few differences to it. They incorporated a few 80s like rock elements, which is a little strange. I think it threw a few people off at first, but they've always had really solid European flavored power metal as their backbone ever since this second album, which is one I would highly recommend. Great band playing power metal. That's excellent. Hellstar is still live and kicking. Last time I checked, they've made a lot of albums in the 2000s, and I haven't heard all of them. Some of them I've heard though, and they're pretty good. Hellstar has always flown under the radar, but they have this great power speed basis, and again they've got kind of a little bit of a neoclassical flair to their music sometimes. Always featured great guitars. You've got James Rivera's excellent vocalist. Hellstar, criminally overlooked. Last U.S. band, Jagdpanzer is still around and making really, really solid albums. And here's a point where, yes, this is trending more into the US style power metal. And if you want to call that trad metal or classic metal, fine. I'm not going to fight you over that. That works just fine too. But I think it appeals to some of the same crowd. And here's another case of a band playing with a concept. Their most recent album, The Hallowed, it follows a story from like a comic book series or something. Post-apocalyptic, big long winter. Humans and animals have to become more symbiotic with each other so that they all can survive. And in the end, they do, and everybody's happy, and they all lived happily ever after. Yeah, that may or may not appeal to anybody, but the point is the music still delivers and kicks ass just as well as anything Jagdpanzer's done in the past 20 years. And then they just add this story to it, to give it a theme. The story doesn't overshadow the music. The music does the talking. Very cool album. Kind of related to power metal, you have the new wave of traditional heavy metal. And some of those bands lean, into a doomy direction. Some of them lean into epic direction. Some lean into a power speed directions. A couple of recommendations there. Canada's Traveler is relatively popular. They just released their third album this year. This is their second. I haven't got a hard copy of their third one yet. They deliver a really good style that's right there between traditional and power metal and a little bit of speed thrown in. Great band. Another one from Canada that I like even more is Riot City. Yes, the graphics these bands use could be considered cheesy. They're obvious throwbacks to early to mid 80s traditional and speed metal bands. But again, the gimmick doesn't override things here. It's not the only thing going for them. Musically, these guys are excellent. Great vocalists, killer guitar work, lots of songs that can get stuck in your head for ages. But they're songs that are every bit as denim and leather as they are laser shooting cheetah creature robot thing. You look at this, you get a laugh out of it. It's funny, but then you put on the music and it's like, it is time to air guitar and headbang. Absolutely. A few examples here to wrap up that lean a little bit more towards the epic metal direction. Is epic metal its own subgenre? I'm okay with that, but it shares a lot of common ground with power metal. Again, there's a lot of blurry boundaries here. These bands tend to be a little more mid-paced. Some of the song structures are a little bit longer. They mine a lot of the same fantasy elements that power metal acts tend to do, but these bands tend to do it better. And part of it is that developing the songs, letting them run a little longer, not leaning on the choruses so much, but letting the whole song develop to tell the story. Eternal Champion has been one of the main faces in this style. Took me a little while to get into these guys, but both of their first two albums have been quite good. Enjoying quite a bit now. Just took a few more spins. International band Smolder. is very good in this genre. And again, these bands, they're looking, more to like, the Robert Howards and, the Lovecrafts and the Clark Ashton Smiths for inspiration. And they mine the material and they do it pretty well. Some of these mines have about been mined out. We've had a lot of Conan metal and a lot of Lovecraft metal over the years. But yeah, these bands still look to at least put in, the effort and work to use that source material well. It's not just something something dwarf, something something sword, laser shooting dinosaur, repeat the chorus again. It's like, no, this song is very specifically from this, one story that Howard had published, in Weird Tales in 1933 or something. And you can go deep into that rabbit hole if you want to. There's something to investigate and learn about there. It's not just, hoots flying through a galactic terror vortex that you made up as some word soup. Couple more to wrap up the epic metal vibe. Utah's Visigoth, great band. Guys here involved with other excellent projects like Caladan Brood. But yeah, this is more their kind of epic traditional metal outlet, and it's fantastic. It leans towards power metal a bit. I think there's definitely crossover appeal there. They've done a couple of albums, and this is the one I'm more familiar with. Excellent album. And last, but certainly not least, the excellent Fer-de-Lance. This band was recommended to me by a viewer quite a while back. I'm so sorry, I do not remember who it was. There are a lot of things I'm good at remembering in this world. Who recommends what album to me, I am just not good at. And I do apologize for that. But Fer-de-Lance, yeah, here they've got a vocalist, a little bit, more full voice, a little, lower. I would guess he's a baritone. I could be wrong. I'm not good with that kind of musical terminology. Yeah, they've got some different instrumentation involved here. And again, sticking, to a mid pace quite a bit, but, doing really good songcraft here, not just, a one trick pony kind of scenario at all. But yeah, they develop a very rich, fully rounded sound that I've enjoyed quite a bit on this album, which is the Hyperborean. I think to date it's the only full length album. Feels like they're overdue for another one. I'd love to hear them do more. So there you go. I think that was about 10 recommendations that, if like myself, some of the current bands like Alestorm, Windrose, and Gloryhammer just don't quite work for you, that's okay. You don't have to feel bad about it. Just realize there's lots of other power metal out there that might connect with you, that you might enjoy a lot more. And don't dismiss the entire genre just based on a couple of bands leaning into the cheese in a sort of, very obvious way. Again, these bands have made it work for them so that they've been successful and developed a fan base for it. And that's fine. I'm not trying to gatekeep them. I'm not trying to say they're not metal or not true or anything like that. Maybe there comes a point where I hear other material by one of these bands and it clicks better. I have noticed I don't mind these bands too much in very small, limited doses. Have one song pop up in a YouTube feed. I'm fine with it. I'm not going to reach over and skip the track or anything. It's just that, when it starts being song after song after song, I feel like, their gimmick starts to wear thin for me very fast and I lose interest. Whereas lots of the other bands I've just recommended, I don't have that problem with. So that's my power metal statement for tonight. Now, let's talk metal in the comments down below. Are there other current power metal bands that you really enjoy, that you would like other people to check out and you think they might enjoy as well? Are there certain styles of power metal you really enjoy? Are there certain styles that you just can't get into? I know a lot of folks don't like the, symphonic Nightwish themed bands. That's okay. I know some people don't like the fantasy themed stuff whatsoever. That's also all right. But yeah, if you think there are some bands out there that deserve more attention, put them in the comments so other people can read them, maybe see something or catches their eye. They'll file it in the back of their head and they'll go check it out and maybe they'll end up enjoying it too. All right, that is going to do it for this video. So until next time, as always, please take care of yourself. And as always, keep banging your head.